Hi there. In this video we're going to finish the knight c3 direction with one of the interesting sidelines, which is actually knight c6 for black. Let's have a look at this. e4, e6, d4, d5, and after knight c3, all of a sudden black decides to play knight to c6. So it does look very strange because black decides not to undermine the center with a c7, c5 move. But, well, there is some logic behind this move, so black is trying to attack d4 with pieces. For example, the most natural move here is something like e5, like asking what are you going to do with the center, leads to something like f6, so that is the main idea. Instead of undermining the center with a c7, c5, black tries to do this from the other side, and the main idea behind it is if, for example, white captures, black may decide here to take with the knight or maybe with the queen even, just attacking d4 and then quickly completing the development, trying to play something like e5 in the future, getting rid of the weaknesses and getting free play. So that's the idea behind it. So something that looks like the main choice for white is knight to f3 move in this position, protecting the pawn on d4 and delaying playing e5. But black continues with the knight f6, and now it's time to make a decision. Simply protecting the pawn with the bishop d3 may be not so efficient because of black's bishop b4 move, pinning the knight, and again attacking the pawn on e4. So I think it's a good idea for white to try e5 right now. In this case, instead of going to d7, which would be just a terrible positional mistake in this case, because in that case, look at knights, so they're both passive and there is no way for black to play c5, at least quickly. So instead of doing that, black jumps with the knight to e4 here. Main idea being that if there is an exchange on e4, then after d takes e4, black attacks the knight on f3 and hence wins the pawn on d4 on the next move. So knight takes e4 is not an option for white here because of this tactics. So instead of doing that, white has a choice between two interesting directions. So the one is naturally looking bishop d3 move, which I would say is the main line here, attacking the knight and simply continuing with the development. Another one looks pretty strange at first glance, but it also has some interesting ideas behind it, is just moving the knight away from c3. So let's start with this one. I'm talking about the move knight to e2. So the idea is that on c3, the knight is anyway doing nothing. It's kind of passive and is an object of attack for black's minor pieces, let's say the knight e4 and the bishop, which comes from f8 to b4. Going to e2, white prepares c3, protecting the pawn on d4 just in case it's needed. And white just starts the maneuver of the knight. From e2, the knight can go to g3 or maybe to f4. Both options are possible here. So black's natural reaction is to continue with the main idea, just to undermine the pawn e5 with the f6. And now white has this choice between knight f4 and knight to g3 move. So let's start with the knight to g3. It leads to some interesting lines for sure, because after black captures on e5, it's still possible just to recapture on e5, but it's too dry. Much more interesting is to try bishop to b5 jump. So temporarily sacrificing some material for some real activity. And it's not only about, the current situation, I mean that the knight is pinned and so on. It's a justified positional decision. So the knight is the main defender of the e5 square, and if white manages to get rid of that knight, it will be possible to occupy e5 with the knight, which will become an amazing outpost. That's basically the main idea behind this move. So black captures on d4. Prior to taking that pawn, white captures on e4. You will understand why it's happening shortly. So d takes e4, and now knight takes on d4, and just look at the pawn structure. So black's pawns are ruined for now, at least in the center. There are lots of weaknesses all around the king, so black has to be really careful not to lose more. At the moment, the knight is hanging, so black has to do something. Queen usually goes to d5. Good central decision and good place for queen, from where the queen controls a lot. Important squares, also preventing queen h5 check. But white has a very active c4 move, attacking it. So in this case, black has to be extremely careful because if black decides, for example, to punish white for super activity, starting with the bishop b4 check here, it may look very promising, but in fact it appears very bad decision after simple bishop to d2 move. Now to justify bishop b4, black has to capture the knight on d4. In this case, white simply captures the bishop on b4, and the knight is pinned, so it's not handing a piece. So if there is an exchange on d1, let's say rook comes to play, and black has simply a terrible pawn structure, white has pair of bishops, it's hard for black to complete a development, so it's not good. But taking on b2 is also not very good, because after that, white just plays rook to b1, keeping on attacking the queen here, and if black decides to capture on a2, it may end up with just a quick checkmate, I believe, after queen h5 check. So it's better for black just to come back home at the moment. Queen f6. White can take on c6 now. And after b takes c6, the pawn structure becomes even worse. And now white has this maneuver. Queen h5 check first. Then after g6, queen jumps to a5. And look at this position. So yes, black has some extra material, but all the pawns are corrupted, and it's impossible to do anything with these extra pawns, while white is just dominating the field, having much better bishop here. Once again, we have a pattern with opposite colored bishops in the middle game. It's important to have the attacking possibilities here, and I think white is the only side here that has the attacking possibilities. This bishop is just a typical French one, extremely limited with on pawns, while white's bishop is amazing and supported by queen and other heavy pieces. White will deliver a long-term pressure in this position. But there is a solution, at least for now, to actually prevent the worst, and it is basically not to play bishop b4 check. So let's get back to that moment. So in this position, instead of playing bishop b4 check, it's possible just to step back to d6, and if white continues with the capture on c6 in this position, then black has a chance to exchange queens. So queen takes d1, king takes on d1, and here is a solution. So obviously you cannot take the knight here, but it's pretty typical for this setup. So black just attacks the bishop, and it's not so simple for white to actually keep the extra material on the board, because if the bishop steps back to a4, it's no longer protected. So something like bishop d7 may solve a problem. So the knight is pinned, and black is able to capture on c6 next move. It's still a terrible pawn structure, but at the very least, there is no queens on the board anymore, so white doesn't have this direct attack against the king. All right, so in the game that we're discussing right now, it was knight to d4 move, which I don't believe the best decision here, because after a takes b5, knight takes b5, and bishop to d6, dynamically black is doing all right here, more or less. So after a few moves, black managed to solve all the problems. After knight to c3, bishop to d7, black came up with a very nice trick. So at first glance, it looks like white is just having extra material here, extra pawn, and great chances to convert it. But right now, black plays bishop a4 check, and after king to e2, bishop to b3, using the fact that the pawn a2 is pinned, it's not possible to take the bishop, which means both pawns c4 and a2 are under attack. So after knight d6, cd6, king to d3, d5, c captures d5, and bishop takes d5, the game ended in a draw, because now we have opposite colored bishops no longer in the middle game but in the endgame stage, and of course black attacks both g2 and a2 and is going to regain the missing material. So that's about knight to g3 option. White has also knight to f4 option, so let's have a look at that one. So another option is to put the knight on f4 here, and here's an idea behind it. So while f4, the knight is going to occupy d3 a bit later. It will be important in case white will have some sort of outpost on e5 here. There are, of course, different options, but the most logical is just to continue the development with the bishop e7. And now white captures on f6. At first glance, it's exactly what black wants to achieve with this line, so the attack against d4, but we can see that white easily solves the problem and plays c3. So the pawn is protected, and what's important here, black cannot get rid of the weakness immediately playing e5, because as you can see from f4, the knight attacks d5 indirectly. Once e5 is played and, for example, these pawns are gone, then d5 will be under attack. So white is controlling the situation here, and after black is castling, white keeps on developing pieces. Bishop goes to e2, keeping d3 empty, because the knight is going to occupy that square. Bishop goes back to e7, and now bishop goes to b5. Very interesting example. So bishop e2 and then bishop b5. What's the point? Well, the idea is to fight for e5 square. Now, since bishop went away, white has real chances to get there. So bishop goes to d6 now, controlling that square, and the knight steps back to d3. So pretty logical, just right in time. First bishop b5 to fight for e5 indirectly, then occupying d3 with the knight. Otherwise, bishop would be locked here on e2. So the next is bishop to d7. White castles. White is ready to take on c6 and put the knight on e5 at any moment. So black is also fighting for that square with pieces. Some ideas are connected with probably moving the rook to h5 and other stuff connected with the counterattack on the king side. And, you know, this position is pretty complicated, and it's hard to say who is playing for which result. Basically, both sides have some chances here. For example, bishop goes to e8, trying to put the bishop on h5 in a game we're discussing. Here, white decided to go g4, super aggressive. The idea is to prevent bishop h5, to kick the rook away from this active position, and after rook f8, just to occupy e5 finally. Bishop captured on c6. Pay attention to black's decision here, which is also counterintuitive at first glance, taken with the pawn, so damaging own pawn structure, but adding the resource to fight for the central squares after c5. Knight went to e5, black undermined the center with the c5, f3, counterattack with the c4. Very nice exchange of, you know, different threats, and actually it's really unclear position. So knight went to f4, then bishop captured on e5, d captured on e5, knight went to c5, intending to bring the knight to b3 or d3 a bit later. White decided to play bishop to e3, completing the development, attacking the knight, and black came up with the exchange sacrifice here, with the positional idea. So if bishop takes on f4, the knight lands on d3, preparing super aggressive play in the center based on c5 and d4. So instead of taking that rook, white decided to capture on c5. So finally here we reach a position which is, in my opinion, more or less balanced. So we have, again, the opposite colored bishop's middle game, but it doesn't feel like either of the sides has real chances to attack the king. So everything depends on other factors, and I believe these factors are pretty much balanced. So let's get back to the position after black's moved knight to e4 to see if white has something more promising. And I believe that bishop d3 is exactly the move that gives white better chances compared to knight e2. So exactly in this position, white decides to continue with the development and brings the bishop to d3, attacking the knight. Of course, black doesn't want to capture on c3 in that case. Well, position is still playable, but the question is, what did black achieve with all these actions? So the knight is definitely misplaced. There is no c5, and white made all the natural moves and is ready to castle and then continue with the attack on the king side, right? So instead of doing that, black continues with the development of the dark squared bishop to b4, again creating a threat to the knight c3. and indirectly protecting the knight on e4. It's still not a good idea for white to capture on e4 because of d takes e4, attacking the knight, and then grabbing the d4 pawn. So white usually responds with the bishop d2, easily protecting the knight on c3. And here comes probably the main idea behind this line. So black actually manages to get the pair of bishops. The other question, if it is really a valuable factor here, I don't know. So knight captures d2, queen captures on d2, and after black is castling, it's one of the possibilities. We will get back to f6 a bit later. So white can play a3. And now, well, if you want to keep both bishops on the board, I mean, if you want to keep the advantage of pair of bishops, you should go back to e7. But as I said before, it's kind of very strange advantage because position remains really closed, and we know that pair of bishops is valuable only in the open position, and it's not so simple for black to force the opening of the position. And once again, the knight is misplaced, so it's kind of hard to coordinate everything here, I would say. And white, on the contrary, has plenty of different active options. But I still believe that even this is perfectly playable, so you should give it a try if you want. So the other option after a3 move is to move the bishop to a5, but I find it even worse than having it on e7. So after b4 and bishop to b6, the knight can go to a4, now controlling the situation. Basically, white is fighting for dark squares here, intending to occupy c5 at any moment. If black captures on d4 in this case, at first glance it looks like just a good continuation, but after some exchanges here, so bishop takes h7, very simple shot, then queen captures on d4, we may notice that black is left with the wrong set of pieces. So again, the knight, which is great in positions of this type, against the bishop, the French bishop, which is limited with own pawns. So yeah, black has some options here. For example, f6 looks interesting, but then castles, f takes on e5, queen takes on e5, rook goes to f5, attacking the queen, queen goes to g3, and e5. And at first glance, it's just perfect setup for black because look at the center and so on, but pay attention to the king, so it's completely exposed here, and it's a long-term factor. And this center is not necessarily dangerous for white because what to attack indeed. So you can push your pawns to e4 and d4, but then what? White has very simple centralization here, so the rook may come to d1, for example, right now. That is what happened in the game. And it's unclear how to complete the development the right way because knight is about to jump to c5, so you cannot simply play bishop e6 or something. You'll have problems after knight c5. There's also another idea, for example, knight to c3 and then to e4 and then closer to the king. So the king is the main factor here, I would say. So white is doing well. Let's get back a bit and see what happens if black undermines the center after white recaptures on d2. So here, instead of castling, black decides to undermine the pawn immediately. And after a3 move, simply captures on c3, one of the examples. So there is, I believe, no strict theory in this line. So I'm just showing you some of the examples from grandmaster practice. So queen captures on c3, then f captures on e5. So in this case, at least white doesn't have this outpost on e5, but after d captures on e5, we may notice that, again, the set of pieces is good for white. Well, pay attention to the perspectives of light squared bishops. It still feels like black has a possibility to improve the bishop. For example, after castling, bishop may go through d7 to e8 and then to h5, but it takes time, right? So after bishop d7, white continues with a very active b4. Also interesting move, by the way, controlling dark squares, but also intending to attack the knight and then bring the knight to d4. Perfect setup, I would say. Castling, then just b5, and after knight goes to e7, well, first of all, rook to b1, multi-purpose move. overprotecting b5 pawn, maybe intending to bring the rook to attack through the force rank at some point. Then black plays h6, just preventing knight g5 or bishop h7. There are various interesting options possible. So it's a useful move here. White castles. Black plays rook to c8, very natural stuff. So black prepares c5 or maybe c6, in which case black will get a better pawn structure on the queen side. So queen goes away. At the same time, getting closer to the king side. c5 looks very natural. B takes c6. Knight captures on c6. Queen goes to g4. As I said before, just creating a direct threat of queen g6. And what's interesting, black at the moment just ignores the threat and plays b6. So that is probably one of the most important moments in this game. So the main question here is, why not queen g6 then, creating a threat of queen h7? It's actually not a checkmate immediately, but it feels like the start of the very dangerous attack. And it doesn't feel like black has a defense, at least at first glance. In fact, black has very interesting option here. It is actually to sacrifice the exchange for positional compensation. So as I said, something like queen h7 here should be that dangerous. For example, black can continue with something like king f8 after queen h8, king to f7. And if queens are exchanged, well, it's fine, because black will still have compensation after g takes f3 and knight takes e5. And as you can see, material compensation is one pawn, but white has terrible pawn structure, so black should be more or less fine in this situation. Other pawns are also not very inspiring here, as you can see. So that's mainly the reason why I decided to delay the queen to g6 move, because pawn e5 and the integrity of the pawn structure is very important here. So instead of doing that, white decided just to protect the pawn on e5 with the help of simple rook to e1 move. Now queen g6 indeed becomes an annoying threat, and black decided to prevent that with the help of queen e8, controlling that square simply. And this position is not so easy to evaluate because, well, both sides have advantages and disadvantages. Black's main disadvantage is the bishop, which is still quite passive, and it's not clear if it is possible to improve it. There is also a problem with the weakness of this b1 h7 diagonal, but the advantage is the pawn structure in general. I mean, white doesn't have direct targets here, while black has some targets on the queen side. So the later fight actually was more beneficial for white. White managed to win the game, but I wouldn't say that everything is crystal clear here. So that was basically it about knight to c6 line. It's definitely a sideline, but nowadays you can see this at the very top, especially when it comes to blitz games and rapid games. So you can also try it in this sort of competitions. Just keep an eye on what's going on there at the very top, and you will get some insights. Thanks for watching this, and see you next videos.